building under Criterion A, the area of exploration settlement for its direct association with the earliest period of permanent Euro-American settlement in western New York State, which occurred in the first years of the 19th century, and for its association with the Holland Land Company. The Forsyth Warren Farm is also significant under Criterion C in the area of architecture as a largely intact collection of resources that reflect over a century of use and growth. Resources from the early 19th century are relatively rare in western New York, given the region's role as a key theater during the War of 1812, which led to the complete devastation of major early settlements in Buffalo and Lewiston. Few buildings dating from this earliest period of pioneer settlement in western New York survive.
The Forsyth Tavern is the oldest building in the town of Cambria, and in fact, is older than the town of Cambria itself. It is also one of few surviving buildings from the first Dutch settlers of New York. It was built as a tavern, which means that it was a public house to shelter the area's first pioneering settlers from the harsh frontier wilderness. Its first proprietors, John and Polly Forsyth, were true pioneers who risked everything to settle this new frontier. The tavern was built atop a much older indigenous settlement that was destroyed in the 1600s. John died at the start of the War of 1812, and his widow was left with their 4 children. When the British invaded, they slaughtered and burned a path from Lewiston all the way to the widow Forsyth's tavern. The survivors pled with Polly to leave the tavern and go with them as far east as she and her children could go, but Polly refused to leave the tavern. Instead, she sent her 2 boys away and remained at her tavern with her 2 infant daughters. Luckily for her, the tavern was spared. A young sergeant by the name of Ezra Warren arrived at Polly's tavern with the Vermont cavalry. He and his men turned the tavern into their headquarters and a provisions depot for the United States military. The tavern was almost destroyed again after a spy arrived at York, now Toronto, and reported that Polly was supporting the American troops. But luckily, the tavern survived. That young sergeant returned after the war, and he and Polly were soon married. The tavern would be renamed Warren's Tavern, and the settlement surrounding it, Warren's Corners. Through the years, the tavern was forgotten and fell into disrepair. And then in the 1930s, a young farmhand took board at the Warren farm, and after a few years managed to purchase the old tavern from the last of the Warren family to live in Warren's Corners. His name was Floyd Yousey, and he was the first to campaign for the preservation of the old tavern. He, along with wife, Verda, and his children, restored the tavern and made it into their home. After Floyd's passing, the tavern was sold again, and soon after was abandoned once again. And then it fell into foreclosure. Through a cruel twist of fate, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development made an error in the tavern's paperwork, and the property was forgotten. Looters, vandals, and then animals took over. After about 10 years, the roof suffered a partial collapse, which resulted in devastating damage to the inside.
He lived to be 90. He was right in the thick of the action, and the description in this other nation of the violence of the war in the Niagara frontier was really gripping. I mean, I guess I've read some of that before, but it's never been so concisely presented, and it's wonderful that it's associated with a surviving house, and somehow that man's face sort of sums it all up.
Total abstainer, I'm sure.
But it's I think a commendable nomination, and what the present owner is proposed to do with it is even
It's
more.
fantastic. Is it true that it is impossible to pound a nail into the walnut planking?
Not impossible. We've had a few people not believe you that it was brick and walnut.
Yes,
They
it certainly
attempted it and realized that they...
We did an archaeological survey in this vicinity years ago and talked to the owner at the time, and that's the thing he said. You can't even pound a nail into the black walnut that this house is built.
And that's why it's still standing.
Exactly. it's like concrete itself.
And Bill, do you want to talk about what you found out about Ontario?
Yeah, it's interesting. You blame me, now I blame you, because I got sucked into this whole thing. I wound up buying a book on early building traditions in Ontario, and I'd known there were 2 Dutch barns outside of Toronto somewhere in an open-air museum. But in looking at that book, there were clearly Dutch-framed buildings in York and early Toronto. So these traditions were moving up across the border into Ontario, which is pretty remarkable.
Doug has to take down every wall now in
Yeah.
Niagara County.
I'm sure there's more of this out there.
Could we go back to the photograph of the old veteran, Warren, and the map associated with it?
A local couple, Tyler Booth and Jonathan Newman, contacted HUD and tried to convince them to repair the tavern or sell it to them so that they could. 2 years later, a new roof was put on and it was put up for auction. The Booth and Newman families attended an open house and overheard contractors talking about bulldozing the old tavern and replacing it with something new. And so they purchased the tavern themselves.
August 9, 2019. Mr. Supervisor and members of the Cambria Planning and Zoning Boards. I am a co-owner of Blue Jay Antiques, which was planning to open the summer of 2018 on the property in the town of Cambria known as the Forsyth Tavern. I am writing to levy a formal complaint regarding the manner in which I and fellow co-owners are treated by Mr. McCann, as I now have evidence that confirms I was lied to directly by Mr. McCann, making suspect his integrity and that of every request he has made of us. Concisely, Mr. McCann is stonewalling our project by requesting unnecessary documents. He will not discuss his questions or regulatory interpretation in a rational manner. Mr. McCann's actions toward the Forsyth Tavern are discriminatory and designed to discourage development, resulting in unnecessary financial costs, continue to result in lost revenue, and are remarkably stress-producing. Mr. McCann's behavior is unprofessional and unethical. His interactions include profanity and name-calling. I would be remiss if I did not inform you that Mr. McCann's administrative assistant has engaged in the same level of disrespectful behavior as her superior. While I always expect people to be polite, especially when he or she is paid by my tax dollars, I recognize that she is responding to her supervisor's leadership. My concern is that she will be made a scapegoat for the blocked emails, derogatory comments, ignored phone calls, canceled appointments, misplaced forms, and hang-ups. We've received such treatment from both parties. However, Mr. McCann bears the responsibility for the actions of his staff. Regardless of the repercussions this complaint will ultimately have on the business, discriminatory practices from a public official based on race, creed, or religious, sexual, or political orientations, etc., is intolerable and must be condemned. We will no longer jump through Mr. McCann's hoops. We will, of course, provide whatever is actually necessary to the town and a building inspector available to work with us. The town of Cambria's zoning board granted our permits a year ago after numerous instances of Mr. McCann's stonewalling at that time as well, setting us back the first year. To date, we have lost 2 years of potential revenue and looking at a third year if Mr. McCann continues his current behavior. Based on our business model, the loss could be substantial and grows daily. We need a timely solution. I would be more than happy to relocate, unfortunately, the history. The purpose of our efforts is in that space and cannot be moved. Therefore, the tavern needs to work with the town of Cambria. The question remains, however, as to the town's willingness to work with us and provide us the same level of professional support as was afforded to Kinloch and Sunflowers of Sanborn. From my perspective right now, Those are just two more shining examples of the discriminatory practices of Mr. McCann toward the Forsyth Tavern and the level of lost revenue and emotional wellness it has cost. Although I fully expect negative repercussions from Mr. McCann, and unfortunately you as well, I'm requesting in a manner much more respectful than I have been treated by your staff. An opportunity to develop a productive working relationship between the owners of the Forsyth Tavern, you and all the members of the planning and zoning boards. Thank you in advance for your time.
You need to have a reason that affects the entire town, not just what one neighbor says in the town.
The town of Cambria never responded to Dr. Booth's letter, but they did write a law that would revoke the Forsyth Tavern's permit to host special events, making it law that any property with less than 7 acres was forbidden from hosting public events. The Forsyth Tavern contained only 5 acres and would not be allowed to reapply for the permit that it had been granted just 2 years prior.
Some people in Cambria are concerned about the effect a new ordinance could have on them. That ordinance was just approved tonight, and it could affect businesses like breweries and sunflower farms. News 4's Erica Brecker is back from tonight's heated hearing. Erica?
Don, the ordinance passed 3-2 despite the uproar. Some of these new restrictions include limited hours of operation, new parking, and dust and noise control. It also means some ag businesses would have to either get a site plan or a special permit for some events approved. Many business owners and residents believe the ordinance will hurt the town's right to farm reputation by adding stiff restrictions that would make it harder for some of these attractions to operate. The council did tell people at the hearing that they would amend the ordinance based on some of the issues raised tonight, even though they passed it first. Town Supervisor Wright Ellis declined to comment on camera.
The office of the Town of Cambria Building Inspector. Jim is unable to take your call at this time. If you wish to speak with Donna, dial 111 or leave a short message and Jim will return your call as soon as possible. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Charlotte from the Forsyth Tavern Living History Farm and Museum. I'm here to give you some information about our first ever Fall Fest, which is going to be this coming weekend on Sunday.
Building Inspector James McCann in the town of Cambria sued the Historic Sites Director, claiming that Tyler violated the town's zoning ordinances by refusing to give Mr. McCann building plans for the Historic Tavern. Their charges amounted to up to a year in jail and hefty financial penalties if found guilty. Mr. McCann didn't stop there, however. He also appealed to the town of Cambria Zoning Board of Appeals, asking them to revoke the Forsyth's 3 zoning variances that allowed the property to be used as a house museum and farm. The action was unprecedented since requests like his are supposed to be heard and decided upon in courts of law, and not by untrained townspeople. Even more shocking is that the town waited for the room to clear and shut off the camera before holding a one-sided hearing without anyone from the Forsyth even knowing what was going on.
I'm waiting for Jim. Okay. Building Inspector, do you have anything tonight?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would like the board, or at least a board member, to make a motion to revoke 3 special use permits that were given to Tyler Booth down at his place. He continues after 3 years to avoid giving my department state plans to show the conversion of the house from a residential to a business use, the barn from agricultural to a business use. I have a copy of plans
Wait, did you hear him say that Mr. Booth had refused to give him plans, but that he had a copy of plans with him?
Read out from Troutman Associates that they paid for. I did not. That I agree with what they should have done the whole time to try to make it handicap accessible. There's a lot of things in this historical town, you probably know a lot of it. A lot of things in historical buildings, we can't touch some of the structure in that because of that. But the ramp going in, installing a handicap bathroom would be he's already got a bathroom on the second floor, would be a unisex downstairs. He just refuses to. We just last weekend gave him a little break because we were talking to the attorney he has now, which I have no problem with. He was trying. Mr. Booth continued to flaunt it at us. So I would like somebody to make a motion to revoke these three. I have the motion in my hand. If somebody would be willing to do it, and if I could get a second, then we come back to our way of thinking. Now we go back to square one and start all over again with Mr. Booth.
Okay, so he said that he agreed with the plans that the town had been given, right? So let's look at what those plans said. The plans come from a full code compliance report that the Booths had paid an outside architecture and engineering firm to complete. This document essentially did Mr. McCann's job for him. And since Mr. McCann had up until that point refused to inspect the historic tavern, the hope was that a different building inspector could review the document and then perform the inspection so that the museum could open to the public. The report findings read that, quote, "Pursuant to our evaluation, we are recommending that the Town of Cambria Building Department approve your request for a change of occupancy at the subject property."
There it is. Just read it, please. Do I read this out loud, or please, so it can be inserted on the tape and that? Booth, Forsyth, Warren Tavern, zoning October 25th, 2021. Motion to revoke special use permits. Do I need all these letters? All the letters.
To be clear, Mr. McCann is not on this board, but he was not only able to get a secret, private hearing with them, but he also was able to write their response for them himself. And if that was not enough, this is how that hearing ended.
Anything else, building inspector? No, I think I've done enough damage.
If you missed that, Mr. McCann said that he thinks that he has done enough damage. Mr. Booth and his family would later point out that a public official should never do something with the intent or effect of doing damage to someone or something. Mr. Booth and his family sued the town of Cambria in New York State Supreme Court, requesting that the actions of Mr. McCann in the town of Cambria on that day be reversed and the zoning variances that allowed for the historic site to be open to the public be returned to the property. But then winter came and the unthinkable happened.
The biggest thing is people with autism just have a different way of communicating, and if we take time to learn that language, it's amazing what relationships can be developed.
With so many educational resources right at our fingertips, like Autism Speaks, it has become much easier to understand others. It just takes caring and time.
Autism is an interesting diagnosis because it covers a wide range of symptoms. And so while there's 3 core areas that we associate with autism, how those symptoms present themselves to each person is unique.
When nothing brings her back, it's hard to know what she would say, but I think she wants you to live like the world's on fire, wants you to love like hearts don't break.
So, I struggled with what to do for a while now, and the echoes of my late mother are always playing in my head. She was always a smart one, always the one who knew exactly what to do and had all of the right words. And I'm not her, and I don't have her to take my advice from. But what I do have is what she taught me. And she always taught me that bullies were only as powerful as you allowed them to be. And same with life problems. all you can do is lay everything out in the open and then do something about it. And you can't go by living your life just waiting for something to happen and waiting for someone else to do something for you, because life just isn't always fair, and that's okay. But we can do something. Each of us has a voice, and that voice has power. So I intend to lay everything bare and then do something about it.
6 months later, the town of Cambria rescinded its accusations against Mr. Booth and withdrew its case against him. But it refused to return the zoning variances, and worse, it also refused to allow any further restoration work to be done at the historic site.
So I'm not allowed to get any building permits until 6 more months for any of my properties. Is that where we are?
At this point, that's what I'd say, but maybe if I get the attorneys to go a different way, I'll gladly sit.
Jim, and you don't think that that's wrong, that I can't even get permits for my private house because you don't want to talk to me?
Tyler, why are we having this?
Because, Jim, you're making me have this conversation. I don't want to have this conversation.
Why are we saying no now?
Because we don't
This
think
restricted.
because we don't think it's appropriate for the town of Cambria. That's all we gotta say.
The town continues to insist that the historic site is closed because it still refuses to provide Mr. McCann with plans for the building. It even went as far as to send an order prohibiting tours of the property's cemetery, saying that actions have consequences. But is any of this really about building plans? The families involved say no. They cite a 2009 lawsuit against the neighboring city of Lockport that accused Mr. McCann of using his position as building inspector to obstruct a developer from lawfully obtaining the permits that they needed to complete their project. Mr. McCann retired as building inspector for the city of Lockport, even though he still lives there, and instead took a job in the town of Cambria. Conveniently, both Mr. McCann and the town supervisor announced their retirements in the wake of the Forsyth lawsuit.
For the record, allegations on Facebook and in emails suggest that the town is not supportive of the project, that the town sets up roadblocks and creates unreasonable requirements. Members of the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, and the town board are generally in support of the idea for the project, as evidenced by several special permits which have been issued by the zoning board of appeals in response to Mr. Booth's requests as they were presented to the board.
But those zoning permits had been taken away, forcing the historic tavern and surrounding farmlands to once again be abandoned. But this time, it was not abandoned because no one cared about it. It was abandoned because the local government wanted it to stay that way. The town of Cambria continues to delay the court process. Most recently, the town's attorney was given a 3-month delay for a trip to Italy. Meanwhile, after more than 2 years in court, the historic site is still forbidden from being open to the public, or researchers forbidden from doing any further repairs or restoration work. The Forsyth Tavern will continue to languish until some sort of government intervention takes place.
He was ripping the pages out of the history book. I really feel sorry for him. I think he's going to burn in a very hot place.
A pile of wood and a mound of stone is all that is left of the James Bow Tavern in Silver Spring Township, Cumberland County. The tavern had sat along Carlisle Pike since the 1780s.
But when you destroy non-renewable cultural resources, like the barns and the houses and the factories, they are gone forever. So the message comes back really. History. What history? You choose. It's your history. Preserve it or lose it. Thank you.